Well, welcome to this, the first in a series of 4 sessions designed to help your church-based toddler group make the most of its mission opportunity. In this session, we're going to explore the purpose of a toddler group. But I wanted to start by making a confession and an introduction. I'm Richard Hardy, and I have been and am now a toddler group leader. As such, I know how hard it is to do what you do. And so I wanted to begin by encouraging you, by lifting your sights away from the hard graft of just keeping the sessions rolling from week to week, in order that you might see how special you are, how important what you do really is. I want to remind you of something that you already know, but can often lose sight of, something that you need to remember and remind each other of every time you meet. And I really mean that. It's really important that you reinforce the reality of your situation and really encourage one another to actually see how important the work is, the ministry that you're accomplishing really is, not only in the lives of the children that you have contact with, but also in the lives of the parents as well. I want you to know that you have a special place in God's plan. Now, it may be important that you hear that from me right at the outset of this session and our time together. I can't tell you the number of times when people have come to events like this desperate and on the brink of giving up, really discouraged and wondering why on earth they're making the effort. If that's you, then what I'm about to say is not exclusively for you, but it is God's word to you. You see, I can say that because it comes straight out of Scripture. It comes straight out of the heart of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is himself the head of the church. Listen to his assessment, his appraisal of what it is that you do. This is what he said. He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, I tell you the truth. Truly, truly, I say unto you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. What's he talking about here? He's talking about tekna, little children, a child of early years age. A preschool child, one of the children that walks through your door every single week of your term. Jesus sees little children as central to his notion of what it means to be saved, church, and a disciple. And it's really important for us to understand that, which makes what you do and who you are really important. You are important. Now, that being the case, we can say without hesitation that that's true. What you do is important, not just generally, but particularly. You see, you are the first and maybe the only taste of church that many of these people will have had or may ever have. Secondly, you are the best hope for the church to effectively engage, particularly with a group of people that it has done really badly in engaging with over these past few years, those in their 20s and early 30s. Because if you engage with their children, you engage with the parents. Thirdly, you are the start of their formal education. You are their first interaction, their first contact with people outside of the family home. You are the beginnings of that formal education as they learn to socialize, as they learn micro and macro motor skills, as they begin to do all sorts of things for the very first time in the company of others. And fourthly, you offer a brighter hope for the future. You provide stability where often there isn't any. You provide security. You provide consistency. And you know, that has a real impact in terms of children's well-being and their future development. Listen, even prime ministers start in a parent and toddler group. So what I want you to do is I want you to stand up. I want you to turn to somebody and I want you to look them in the eyes, one of your toddler team, and say, you're important and what you do is important. And I sort of want to encourage you to do that every time you meet, because we cannot hear it often enough. Now, I know what it's like being a parent and toddler group leader. Sometimes it all feels a bit hand to mouth, trying to fit the group into the rest of your life and trying to prepare the craft and plan the songs and clean the toys and police the session and talk to the parents and make the drinks. The list is endless and seems to go on and on. When I was a toddler group leader, every July we would say next year will be different. We'll plan the program early and get organised. And it took a special effort and 2 years to make good on the promise, because it's just hard work to do a session and fit it into the rest of a busy life. Little wonder at times you cannot see the wood for the trees. That's the beauty of a session like this. That's the beauty of a course like this. It gives you the opportunity to think big, to dream, to plan, to look ahead. And with that in mind, I want to make a suggestion that you start this session and the end this session when with time to think, time to pause, time to consider what it is that you're going to get out of it and what you're going to do about it. Take the time to process, take the time to chat, take the time to think it through as we begin to develop and build up each session through this Toddler Talks. So let me ask you, when did you last dream? When did you last take the time to just sit on a park bench, look at the sky and think of your group? And instead of asking why, ask why not? When was the last time you were able to look past the problems and pitfalls and see the potential and the possibilities? Maybe that's the reason why you're on this particular session now. Maybe your whole team has never had the opportunity to actually sit down together and begin to think through what your toddler group is all about. In this session, I want in very practical ways to prime the pump for big dreams. I want to give you something to think about and talk about, not just in the session, but when you leave this session and as you go into the rest of your week. And I want to base it on one passage of scripture. That's Ephesians chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. Let's read it together. I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Now that's my prayer for you and for your group and for those within them, that they might come to know the agape love of Christ through you. We're going to look at 2 of the 4 words used to describe God's love in this session and use them as the sort of hub for what we're going to share together. And then in the next session, we'll look at the other 2. So let's start. Let's start with deep and wide. Sounds like a song, doesn't it? Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. And I want us to seek to answer the question, how do we go deep? How do we go wide with the love of Christ in our group and from our group? And before we look at them individually, there's one thing I want to say generally, and it's this. If we're going to make a difference, if we're going to join people on their journey into the agape love of Jesus and help them to take their next steps, then it is vital, it is essential that we plan for it. It's essential that we look at what we do with this intention in mind, that it shapes and frames every part of the group and its purpose and the way that it's executed. You see, from my experience, it's rare for people to drift into seeking. It's rare for them to drift into an encounter with God. Why? Not because they're not seeking, but because they've never considered church a place where answers may be found. Now, if they think of church at all, they tend to think of it as irrelevant or outdated or intolerant or hypocritical or judging. And part of our role in Toddler Group is to represent Jesus, not represent church, but to undermine their perspectives of church. So let's start with going deep. What does it mean to go deep? Let's ask ourselves, how do we build on what we are already doing? How do we go deep in our group and make what we do really matter and make a difference? How do we make the most of the opportunity? How do we take them deeper into relationship with us and in relationship to the group and therefore in relationship to God? Now for this, I suggest that you get into groups, you get into small groups and you have a bit of a conversation about that question and consider what it is that you need to do to actually make the most of the opportunity. And I want to give you a few pointers and a few ways that you might end up doing that. For me, growing deep is all about extending your influence with those who come, deepening the relationships. And if we're going to do that, then we need to start with the end in mind. You need to ask yourself, what is your goal? What are you in your group aiming to do? Do you exist purely as a social space? Now, if that's the case, then that's fine. I mean, that's absolutely great. And at least it's something that you are intentionally and consciously talking about doing. How do we make this the best social space for them to interact with one another and for the children to interact together? Or you could ask yourself, is your aim to create a place where parents can get together and just chat? Or is it more than that? Only you can make that decision. I can't impose it on you. I can't project it to you. You've got to decide, what is your group about? Now, there'll be similarities and differences between groups, and that will be dictated in part by your church and by your team and by your community. Someone once said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. I think it was Alfred Wainwright, the great hill walker, who said, if you have no goal, you're just wandering about. Hands up. How many of you have a mission or a purpose statement for your group? Something that explains to anybody that wants to know why it is that you exist. The truth is, you all have a goal, whether you realize it or not. For some, the goal is implicit. For others, it's explicit. If it's implied, it still determines what you do and the way you do it. You just don't recognize it yet. But I want to encourage you to do just that, to recognize what your mission is. So what is your vision? What is your grand dream where your group is concerned? Here's the statement the group I led a few years ago came up with to clarify what it is that they were about. It has 3 clear goals. Hullabaloo, which was the name of the group, exists to prepare children for school, to provide parenting support, and in the process to show and share the love of God. It's simple, isn't it? 3 clear goals. It's explicit, it's understandable, it's clear, it's memorable, and therefore it's incredibly helpful. Now, if you haven't got an explicit goal, and I'm not really encouraging you to nick mine, if the truth be known, it took us a while to come to that in the chat and the conversation that we had together as group leaders. But it seemed to summarize what it was that we were seeking to do. I want you to take a few moments to think about it. Pause the session now and ask yourself, what is our vision? What is it that we want to accomplish? What is our goal? And then we'll come back together. So pause now. Now, I want you to remember that there are 3 guidelines that help you to put together a vision statement, a mission statement, a purpose statement, whatever you choose to call it. The first one is this: a mission statement has to be memorable and it has to be measurable. It needs to help you to understand how you're doing. Secondly, it has to summarize what you're about. And thirdly, it has to act as a benchmark for all that you plan to do. You should be able to take any idea that you have for the future and say, how does this help us fulfill our mission statement? And if it does, that's great. And if it doesn't, then you need to ask yourself, do we do it? Or do we need to tweak our mission statement to accommodate it? And I would be very loath to tweak the mission statement. It usually means we don't do that, because it isn't what we are trying to accomplish in our goal. So let's take a few moments and think about that. Talk about it in your team, talk about it amongst yourselves, and see whether you can begin to identify what it is that your group is about. Please don't nick mine. Do the work. I encourage you to think through the issues. Sometimes it comes down to a gut response. The first thing that comes off the top of your head. Write it down individually, and then share it in your group, and see what comes out of what you share. Now, if we're going to go deep, here are 6 things that I think we need to do. Firstly, we need to work with the end in mind. That's what we've just discussed, isn't it? How do we come to a point where we recognize and identify in simple terms what our goal is? Secondly, we need to start where people are, not where we'd like them to be. Jesus always did this. He did this with Zacchaeus. He did it with the woman of Samaria. He did it in every encounter. He met people where they were, and he took them on a journey from there. Now, if they're with us because of their children, because they want to relate to other parents, then that's where we should start. That's what we should talk about. You see, the thing that's brought them to us is a desire for interaction, both for their children and for them. So there's always going to be a social dynamic to the work that we're seeking to do. There's always going to be input that is required where parenting is concerned, because that's where they are. That's what brought them here. And it's really important we recognize that. Generally speaking, people don't come to a toddler group because they want to become Christians, because they want to do religious things. They come to a toddler group because they've got toddlers. Start there. Thirdly, we need to take them on a journey. A journey, in fact, actually multiple journeys, from perceived need to real need, from outside the church to inside the church, from parenting to other areas and issues in their lives. Everything that we do is about journeying together with those that God has given us, starting where they are, but not leaving them there, helping them to move on in terms of their understanding and their appreciation of other things that the church can potentially offer. And in everything we do, we must do it in such a way that we elicit the question, why? What we do must be done with excellence. It must be done with sacrifice. It must be done with grace. It must put us out. It must be about what's best for them, not what's convenient for us. You know, far too often when I've talked to people setting up new toddler groups, they ask the question, when's the best time to actually meet? And I say to them, when did you think of meeting? And they said, oh, well, we've looked at our busy schedules and we've decided that Tuesday afternoon is the best possible time for us to do it. And I said, have you asked those that you're seeking to reach whether that's the best possible time? And they look at me puzzled and go, well, no, that's when we can do it. What they're actually saying is it's convenient for us, not that it's actually going to meet the overarching needs of those that we're seeking to reach. And it's really important we think about that. The toddler group in the church in which I'm set tends to meet on a Tuesday afternoon, which is probably why I mentioned Tuesday. But you know, as we begin to explore, as we begin to ask questions, one of the things that we've realized is it's far easier for people to come to a toddler group after they've dropped off their older children at school than it is to come to a toddler group and have to rush out to pick up their children from school. Now, that would suggest that a morning is so much more effective, so much more helpful than an afternoon. And we're having to think through, do we shift our toddler group as a consequence of the needs of those that we're seeking to reach? And I think the conclusion that we're coming to is yes, we must, because that's the best time for the people that we want to engage with. You see, we must be willing to go above and beyond with what anyone else would do, both in terms of love and in terms of deeds and in terms of words. If we see this as a ministry, if we see this as a mission, then we need to give it our best. One of the churches that I've had contact with over the years is in Northern Ireland, and they wanted to expand and develop their early years ministry. And so what they did was they built a purpose-built building on their site in order that they might run their toddler group from it and develop a nursery through it. And so downstairs they've got the toddler group that meets, it's got outdoor space, and upstairs they've got the nursery that meets, which uses the same outdoor space. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was hugely impressed both with their commitment to the cause and their recognition of the ministry and the mission. And that's something that has really challenged me. So as we look to redevelop our buildings, we're saying, can we create a dedicated space that is devoted to those who are in early years? And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. And then fifthly, we need to recognize the need to keep on keeping on. It's so easy to get discouraged. It's so easy to get sideswiped by the little issues and the little circumstances, which is why it's important to keep that clear goal and keep heading in that direction in order that we might truly see fruit and ministry. Do you know, somebody once said to me that it takes between 4 and 7 years from the first encounter with a Christian to the point where people will make a decision to follow Christ. And so you're not going to actually see people come to faith necessarily on the first day they attend your group because they heard some wonderful presentation of the gospel. The reality is that the big thing that will make the difference is the sacrificial love that they see pointing in their direction that meets them in the group and supports them outside of the group. It will begin to enable them to ask questions. Why are you doing this? Why do you think this is important? And begin to explore what the Christian faith is all about. And that's important. So the fifth point is this: don't stop. Don't stop what you're seeking to do. And then sixthly, always plan for the next step. Always plan what you're going to do next. Never rest on your laurels. Never get comfortable with the status quo. Never think that what you're doing now is going to be suitable in 3 or 5 years' time. One of the big mistakes that toddler group leaders tend to make is to think that the way they did it 30 years ago is still all right today. It really isn't. Things have changed. Education has changed. Child development has changed. The way families are has changed. The commitment to Christ and the church has changed because it's been in decline. And we need to recognize the reality of that. If we don't change with things, then we are going to be left behind, and people will find another toddler group to go to that seems more relevant and more excellent than ours. Do you know, I'm not saying that every toy needs to be brand new, because that would be ridiculous. But every toy needs to be in working order. Every toy needs to look like it's cared for if it's suitable for the group. And we need to recognize the reality of that. Do you know, far too often, because we're thinking about the situation from our perspective, we don't think about the process of drawing people deeper into the group, deeper into relationship and deeper into church. We sort of hope that it will somehow happen. But let's be honest, generally it doesn't, does it? unless we plan for it, unless we're intentional about it. We need to come at the group as though we have never been before. We need to look at it with fresh eyes. And I would encourage you to do that with your group. Pretend like you're coming into your group for the first time. What's the welcome like? What's registration like? What's the welcome pack like? What are the snacks like? What do the toys look like? What's the environment like? What are the toilets like? Ask yourself the questions that you no longer ask because you've sort of got used to it all. And look at it with new eyes. You know, we need to ask questions like, what sort of welcome do we give? And what sort of welcome would we like to give? Where should the welcome start, for example? How does it feel to be new? How can we make sure people aren't left out? What are the toys and crafts like? And all those sorts of things. We need to think about our aims and the steps we provide for people to make a journey. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we should manipulate people, but what I am saying is that if we have not put the steps in place, then we are not taking people on a journey. We're not planning for it. And we need to recognize the reality of that. As I was thinking about this particular point, I came across this fantastic picture. You know, little did Boris Johnson know that he would be the Prime Minister at the time when he stepped in this puddle right up to his middle and never went there again. Now, what happened? He didn't allow for the fact that the puddle was deep and there weren't steps in place for him to be able to get across it without falling in. We need to recognize that too often we make our steps too big into the life of the group and the life of the church. I remember on one occasion a lady asked me, what does it mean to be a Christian? It was her first day in the toddler group. And in my enthusiasm and my recognition of the fact that he was a live one and an opportunity, I absolutely bombarded her with stuff. You know, I told her the gospel in 3 different ways. I gave her a book. I gave her a CD. I gave her, you know, she walked out carrying this bundle of stuff. And all she really wanted was a pithy statement, something that was small and bite-sized and in that moment answered her question. Guess what happened? She never came back to the group again. My enthusiasm had put her off. I'd created too big a step for her to be able to make it, and she'd fallen into the puddle. We need to think about going deep, and we need to recognize that what is required are little steps. What do we need to do in order to provide intentional steps that even if they choose not to take them all, or even any of them, at least they are there for them to be able to take and make the journey safely? Does that make sense? Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to do an exercise that will enable you to think in the light and in the light of your mission statement, that sort of kernel of thought in terms of what your goal is. I want you to ask, what are the steps that we need to put into place to make that mission statement a reality? Now, it may be that you've not come up with a mission statement yet. It may be that in one session it's too much to be able to cope with. In which case, what I encourage you to do is to pause at this moment, go back to the stuff about goals and targets and mission statements, and take as long as you need in order to be able to establish what that mission statement is. And you'll find in this pack with these other resources some sheets that will help you to do just that and to think it through. And then having done that, begin to think about the little steps that you need to take in order to make those things a reality. Do you know, in an ideal world, what you do is identify each element of your mission statement and build your little steps around each. And in a sense, that's what we're going to do here in this session. We're going to say, if there were no limitations and time and money and team made it possible, this is how we would plan. We're going for the ideal. We're reaching for the goal. The 3 parts of our mission statement were to prepare kids for school, to provide help and support for those who are parents, and to show them through the whole process the love of God. And if we were looking to create little steps, then what we do is we'd actually say, okay, let's take each one of those in turn and let's talk about what little steps need to be in place in order for that to happen. If we're going to be preparing them for school, what elements need to be in place within our group that will help them to make that journey? If we're going to support the parents, what elements need to be in place in order that we might help them to prepare the journey? And if we're going to lead them to God, what elements need to be in place? So there would be sort of 3 layers, 3 tiers in terms of what the little steps might look like. Now, that's what we should have done, but that is not what we actually did. You see, that's what you do in an ideal world.